So just as a reminder, we have a spectrum where we have these thresholds, these epistemological thresholds. We have these burdens of proof that law enforcement officers should be mindful of. And we're going to focus on the reasonable suspicion threshold. And we're going to talk about Terry v. Ohio, the stop and frisk law. So we're talking about Terry stops. Terry stops, stop and frisk. And these are actually more than one thing. So this is an issue. It's perennial. It comes up all the time. A lot of Supreme Court cases. It's also extraordinarily important to law enforcement. Law enforcement officers will encounter situations where they have to meet the epistemological threshold of reasonable suspicion daily. So this is a question about the threshold that must be reached for a police officer to stop a person in a public place or an automobile and to question the person about his or her identity, what's going on, and then in some cases frisk the person for dangerous weapons. That's what we're talking about, stop and frisk. So this is a form of search and seizure, and so this is a Fourth Amendment issue, So there are two requirements for a valid stop, for a constitutionally permissible stop. Two requirements: circumstances, initial police action. If the two requirements are satisfied, the officer may conduct a limited search of the outer clothing of the person in an attempt to discover weapons. Right? Two requirements: circumstances and initial police action. Persons stopped by the police cannot be forced to answer questions, but can be forced to identify themselves if that is authorized by state law. So if the state law says, yes, if a police officer stops you, you have to identify yourself, then police officer can. It's permissible under the Constitution. If the state law requires it, they can ask you to identify yourselves, and you must identify yourself. Doesn't mean you have to answer questions beyond that, but if your state law requires it, the Constitution permits it. When we're talking about a Terry stop or a stop and frisk kind of a stop, frisking, there is only one justification for confiscating anything, and that's whether or not the object might reasonably be considered a weapon. So if you have a hunting knife on you, let's assume it's perfectly legal, but if you have a hunting knife on you, they can confiscate that if it's a weapon so that they can ask you your identity. And a valid frisk can turn into a valid search if, in the course of the frisk, the officer gets probable cause to think that the object is seizable. So let's assume that they're frisking and they feel a knife and in your pocket, and they can clearly tell it's a knife, so they confiscate it, and then they look at it, and it's an automatic knife. It's a switchblade, and in your jurisdiction, it's not legal to possess. Then that can turn into probable cause to seize it and maybe even arrest you. Didn't start off with probable cause, but you ended up with it. If the officer, while not violating the Constitution, staying within the very narrow limits of a frisk for weapons, feels what he has probable cause to believe isn't just a weapon but contraband, the officer may expand the search. So if an officer is patting someone down for weapons and feels several different baggies with what feels like a powdery substance in it, might be able to expand that search to determine whether it's heroin or cocaine or something like that. So the officer can switch from dangerous weapons to, wait a minute, this isn't a weapon, but this feels like drugs. And you can turn a frisk for weapons into a search and seizure of something that might be contraband or just flat out illegal. Are fishing expeditions allowed, you might ask? No, not on paper. You cannot use a frisk for officer safety to see if there's any weapons that are dangerous. You can't use it to see if there's some type of other evidence. Now, it is not false that officers do often find other evidence when they're frisking someone and patting them down, but you're not allowed to do a fishing expedition. Hey, I don't like the way that person looks. Let's pat him down for officer safety. Oh, look at all the drugs we found. You're not allowed to use it as a fishing expedition. Not allowed to. Now, does it happen? Well, there's probably a fine line between that, but it is not constitutionally permissible to do so. So what about race? Are stops based on race alone valid? First question, can race be taken as one factor in the totality of the circumstances when determining reasonable suspicion for a stop? All right, fair question. Well, racial profiling is banned by state law in many areas. And racial profiling is banned in federal law enforcement, except for possible terrorism and national security suspects. So it's not clear. Now, do I think race plays a part? Yes, I'm sure it does. Now, what if you had more than just sort of a neutral situation? What if you said, well, there was a white man that was running from the bank. He took his mask off and he was clearly white. And his partner was black. After he took his, we got it on camera, but we can't see their face. So we have someone who's white and someone who is black. And then the officers find some people that are about the same build, and there's someone who is white, there's someone who's black, and there's someone who is Hispanic. Can they choose to pat down the white person and the black person? Probably so, but that's different. That's not saying, well, I don't like the way that person looks. So if you make a stop just based on someone's race, not based on information, well, we saw this guy fleeing from the bank, and you have additional circumstances to inform you, it's not allowed. The issues of terrorism, well, it makes that a little bit more muddy, unfortunately. So there are two separate acts to keep in mind when we're talking about stop and frisk. Don't forget the and. Right? A stop is justified only if the police officer has reasonable suspicion that criminal activity is about to take place or has taken place. A frisk is a pat down for weapons. A frisk that goes beyond a mere pat down is illegal. So you can stop and then you can frisk. Two separate acts. So don't forget about that. When you're talking about stop and frisk, it's not just about the pat down. It's also about the initial stop too.